Welcome back, everyone. So today we'll be discussing the French and the Dutch in this episode of Colliding Cultures. So in the 16th century, France, much like Spain, was a Catholic nation very much committed to expanding their wealth in the name of Catholicism around the globe. French colonization developed through investment from private trading companies. And so in this map on the right hand side, you can see North American, Spanish, French, and British territories circa 17. And so early French exploration. So 1534, we have Jacques Cartier claiming Northern America for France, particularly the area around St. Lawrence River. He claimed in the name of New France. And so Cartier made exaggerated claims about the area's mineral wealth, and was unable to send great riches back to France, or establish a permanent colony. Then in 1601, we have Samuel de Champlain, who explored the Caribbean in 1601 and the coast of New England in 1603. By 1608, he established Quebec and made a number of Atlantic crossings as he worked tirelessly to promote New France. And so it was under Champlain that the French foster a relatively positive, relationship with indigenous peoples. And Champlain felt like this was essential for trade, right? And so the main interest of the French at this time is the fur trade in North America. So unlike the Spanish, who were in pursuit of gold, you have the French, who are more so interested in the fur trade and not really as invested in establishing large cities or settlements. As a result of his positive relationships with indigenous peoples, he was able to explore the Great Lakes region, the Hudson Bay, and eventually made it to the Mississippi, as far west as the Mississippi River. And so the French made an alliance with the Hurons, as well as the Algonquins, and they were in such close relationship that Champlain even agreed to fight for them against their enemy, the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, right? And as a result of their investment in the fur trade, far more than establishing permanent settlements, there weren't that many French women, right? And so many French fur traders married indigenous women, and this was so commonly practiced that their children were often called métis. Very few French people traveled to the New World to settle permanently. This is largely because the fur trade shaped colonization of continental North America. French colonization developed through investments and private trading companies, as opposed to from the crown itself, right? So in 1603, we see Port Royal, Acadia being established. 1608, Quebec is founded and then later becomes New France. And at this time, the French were not exactly known for their religious tolerance. And so by the 1680s, it becomes illegal to be Protestant in France. And we see this reflected in the colonies, as well as all non-Catholics were forbidden to be in New France. But along with this piece around religion, we see Jesuit missionaries adopting different conversion strategies than the Spanish by living alongside indigenous peoples. This nature of colonization is, I will argue, drastically different in North America than what took place in the Caribbean. So by 1635, you have the French expanding their colonies to include Guadeloupe as well as Martinique in the Caribbean. And it was there that they had lucrative sugar plantation sites, that utilized African enslaved labor, excuse me. Then they later seized Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, which becomes the wealthiest colony in all of the Americas. And so the Huron developed a rather close relationship with the French, many of which converted to Christianity and also engaged in the fur trade. However, while the Huron, I will argue, were good for the French were not good for the Huron, in the sense that the Huron, due to their close proximity with the French, became decimated by European diseases. And so also we see this establishment of what has been termed more recently by historians middle ground. And this comes as a result of the Iroquois in the East really being quite formidable and pushing many Algonquin-speaking peoples towards French territory in the mid-1600s. And so the geographic area from the Great Lakes to the upper Mississippi Basin became known as middle ground. This was both geographically as well as socially a space to be in between cultures, peoples, in between empires, and kind of the non-state world of the villages of the Algonquin European peoples, right? So we have a lot of exchange culturally happening. And so we see French traders attempting to adopt gift giving, which was a common indigenous practice, as well as adopting some of the mediation strategies that were utilized by indigenous leaders. Indigenous peoples similarly would engage in the very impersonal nature that was the European market, and often adapted, sometimes just, haphazardly, European laws. We also see that this Great Lakes region experienced tumultuous success throughout the late 1600s, early 1700s, until English colonial officials and American settlers began to swarm the region, to which this expansion of colonization proved to be very hard on the positive relationships that the French and indigenous peoples. So on to the Dutch. In 1581, we see the Netherlands officially breaking away from the Habsburgs, and they earn themselves this reputation as being the freest of all European nations. Freest in terms of religious tolerance, but also even in terms of gender dynamics. So we see Dutch women maintaining separate legal identities from their husbands, and could even hold property as well as inherit full estates. The Dutch were by far the most advanced capitalists of the era. They had, for example, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which was the world's oldest stock exchange that is even still in existence to this day. That was founded in 1602 by the Dutch East India Company. And the Dutch East India Company was actually established in the same year. And it was a chartered company when the States General of the Netherlands granted it a 21-year monopoly to carry out trade activities in Asia. The Dutch East India Company is often considered to have been the first multinational corporation in the world. And also it was the first company to issue stock. If we were to translate its worth into the present day, it was worth $7.9 trillion, like US currency, in the present day. We see the Dutch West India Company being established in 1621, which established colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, as well as North America. This brings us to colony of New Netherland. So in 1609, the Dutch commissioned Henry Hudson to find fabled Northwest Passage through North America. He couldn't find it because it didn't really exist, right? And so instead, he claimed New Netherland for the Dutch, and New Netherland became an essential part of the Dutch New World Empire, which became inspired by Hugo Grotius. Hugo Grotius was a legal philosopher, and he believed that indigenous peoples possessed the same natural rights as Europeans did. Shocker. But this was like quite radical philosophy for the time. And so by 1626, we see Peter Minuit buying Manhattan from the Munsee people. Right? Heads of the colony insisted upon purchasing land from indigenous peoples as opposed to just regular thief. In 1626, we see Peter Minuit, who bought Manhattan from the Munsee. And why I say bought in quotes is for a couple of reasons. So one, historians are not exactly sure that he even bought land from the correct people. But also, even in terms of like language and philosophical differences, there wasn't a clear understanding of exactly what was taking place on the behalf of the Munsee people. And I guess in some ways on the behalf of the people of New Netherland, because they're assuming that everything's on the up and up, right? A part of this comes even into like indigenous philosophy, where you cannot own land, right? So in Europe, just like in the United States today, there's private ownership, right? Like you can privately own a home, you can own land, but indigenous peoples at the time were like, you can't own land, right? Like that sounds ludicrous. Just as ludicrous as today if I were to say that you could own the clouds. You can't own the clouds. And so to even say, for someone to say, oh, I'm buying this land, has a completely different implication, even if you are speaking the same language. Much like the French, the Dutch were far more invested in money than conquering anyone. And so we see trade with indigenous peoples becoming New Netherlands' central economic activity. Dutch traders would exchange wampum even. Wampum is the shell that you see at top left. And then the shell in the bottom left-hand side in the picture has been turned into a belt, right? And so we would see wampum being used for ceremonial and diplomatic commodity amongst the Iroquois. It could also be used as currency. It could buy you a loaf of bread. It could buy you a whole house or a piece of land, what have you. Wampum was often exchanged for beaver pelts, right? So you have the people of New Netherland being very invested in the fur trade. And in relation to labor, because labor is important, right? How are you going to have a colony with no labor? So you have a system called the patroon system that was developed by the Dutch. And so the Dutch would establish farms, settlements, lumber camps, but at the same time, this expansion also correlated with diminished relations with local indigenous communities, as settlers are ever trying to expand to get more land. This then encroaches upon indigenous territories that were not paid for, right? Paid for. And so we also see the West India Company directors implementing a patroon system to encourage colonization. And so what this patroon system did was it granted large estates to wealthy landlords, who then would pay for the passage of tenants to work their land for a certain period of time. And so they ran into an issue in the sense that they could not bring enough indentured servants to satisfy financial backers. And so by 1626, we see 11 enslaved Africans being brought into the colony. And by 1660, you have New Amsterdam having the largest urban enslaved population. We see enslaved African labor being the primary means that even the city of New Amsterdam was built upon. Like, for example, Wall Street was built by enslaved labor. In the 1600s, enslaved African labor was not a part of a comprehensive system yet, right? It was becoming a comprehensive system, certainly by the 1700s. But what I mean by that is there were certain ways where it wasn't as exploitative. Now, I'm not saying that slavery was great in the 1600s by any stretch of the imagination. What I mean by that is this. So, for example, you have enslaved Africans being able to successfully sue for back wages when several enslaved people who were owned by the Dutch West India Company fought for their colony against the Munsee people, who, mind you, they bought land from, right? These enslaved Africans petitioned for their freedom, saying, hey, we fought for y'all, we earned this, right? And so they actually won like a pseudo freedom or a half freedom that allowed them to work their own land in return for paying a very large tax to their enslavers. The children of these half-free laborers remained unfortunately enslaved by the West India Company. We also see in the New Netherlands this kind of conflict of interest between morals and economics taking place, right? Because you have some New Netherlanders, say that 5 times fast, protesting the enslavement of Christianized Africans, because they're no longer heathen, they're good Christians, so therefore we shouldn't be enslaving good Christian people, right? However, in the end, the economic goals of the colony won out, right? The colony was like, we are far more invested in money than we are in this whole like freedom thing that we keep on espousing, both, back home as well as in this colony. The much boasted liberties of the Dutch came to exist alongside the increasingly brutal systems of slavery, right? And so by 1770, the Dutch were so reliant upon the transatlantic slave trade and enslaved African labor. 5.2% of the Dutch GDP, gross domestic product, was based upon Atlantic slavery. So if you need a comparison as to how much 5.2% really is in this present moment with a different sort of economy, the digital economy in the United States made up 6.2% of the US GDP in 2019. Okay, so I'm going to pause us here in our conversation on colliding cultures. I hope you guys stay tuned. Take care.